Today we're going to be thinking about Matthew's Gospel and reading some verses which describe Jesus instructing his disciples about how to live. He's sending them out as missionary agents and he gives them a clue about how they're supposed to live. A few acts of behaviour: when you go into a village, say this, do that, and so on. And particularly focus on one verse. Now, I know that if you live here in the UK, you're aware that this is the first week of our second national lockdown. And given all I've been saying about this over months and months now, you'd be amazed if I didn't want to rant about this and to talk about it in the course of this vlog. So I'll say a few things about it, if I may, to start with, just to get it off my chest, really. And then to say something slightly different about this passage in Matthew, so that we can reflect on our responses. How are we supposed to behave as Christians, however we feel, whether we're really deeply frustrated with this, as obviously I am, or whether we're more sanguine and relaxed and it's not affecting us that much and we're perfectly happy to stay at home and to live life in this rather more constrained way. So how are we going to live with differences of view and opinion in this very complicated world in which we live? So just a couple of minutes on lockdown here in the UK, the second lockdown, and then we'll get into this. Just to reaffirm really what many of you are expecting me to say, which is that we don't need a second lockdown, that its imposition is cruel, particularly to the poor and to the young, and will blight their lives even more than they've been blighted. It will lead to much more challenging unemployment figures. Mental health epidemic will grow. Domestic violence will increase. And there will be missed diagnoses of cancer, heart attacks, and a range of other conditions because people will be locked down and too frightened, frankly, to go and explore the National Health Service, particularly with the figures this week that were alarming for the week before, that 50% of the COVID cases were caught in hospital. No wonder people were frightened to go. And as for the statistics and the graphs of doom that were presented last week, I can't think that there is a single intelligent person in the whole UK who will forever perhaps, but certainly for years to come, ever believe any graph that the government presents to them and the figures that were used crazily, totally misrepresentative and based on outdated modelling, all of which since then, as even the governments admit the figures were wrong, they've quietly reissued some of the slides. Theresa May, our ex-Prime Minister in the House of Commons, has said it looks very much like the figures were simply used to justify a decision that had already been made rather than illuminate it. These statistics were used like a drunk uses a lamppost, more for support than for illumination. And it's terrifying, really. 4,000 deaths a day stuff, but just as figment of the imagination. You can call it modelling all you want, but down here in the real world, we're actually looking for evidence based on current facts. So, yes, of course, I think it's mad, and not because it makes me uncomfortable. As you know, I'm in a really blessed situation with a lovely home and a family and food and shelter and safety and all those things people take for granted. But as lockdowns continue around the world, more people will die over the next 3-5 years and maybe longer from disease, from starvation, from social decay, possibly even from violence and war, than are going to die from corona. The cure is now demonstratively worse than the disease. So for all those reasons, I do think we're in a completely crazy situation. And it reminds me, by the way, just to say this, and we'll come to it in a minute, about wise as serpents and harmless as doves. That's the clue for the passage we're talking about. It reminds me about the importance of the teaching of Jesus about the behaviour of the disciples and therefore about our behaviour. So here are these words for us to reflect on, whatever we're feeling about lockdown and its imposition over this next month at least, from the teaching of Jesus. So here's Jesus in Matthew 10, sending them out to heal the sick, to preach the good news of Jesus, He gives us the names of the 12. Go on out there, tell my people about the good news. Don't take lots of cash with you. Just go and be a recipient of the generosity of the people you meet. You give freely and receive freely. It's not payment for work. So get in there, find a worthy person, stay in their home, and act as an honourable guest. So lots of practical advice. And then there's this phrase in Matthew 10, verse 16. Look, I'm sending you out like a sheep among wolves. In other words, guys, this is going to be a tough gig. Don't think that I'm just sending you out and it's all going to be fine. Everybody's going to say, wow, those disciples of Jesus, come on in. We'd love to have you here. No. Many of the people would resist. Who are you to tell us what to do? Who is this Galilean rabbi you're talking about? No, thank you. We don't want anything to do with you. And indeed, in the ancient world, it would have been far less polite with a visiting preacher. You might end up getting roughed up by the local thugs, possibly stoned. Your life would be in serious danger sometimes. So this is not an easy task they're called to, but Jesus gives them this instruction and reminds them, guys, it's sheep among wolves stuff. Look out, I'm sending you into vulnerability. But then this phrase occurs, and this is the New International Version. Therefore, be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And what, of course, the old translations, which many of you like me will remember, it says this: be as wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. So our responsibility in dealing with prime ministers and neighbours, with scientists and friends, with whoever we have to deal with, wherever information comes to us from the largely hysterical media, and certainly from the very biased, divided media, how are we wise in our assessment of that and the people who speak to us? And how, in our wisdom, how do we act with innocence? The modern translations are actually very helpful. Shrewd as a snake. Shrewd may come across as a negative word. He's a shrewd businessman, meaning hard-nosed, bottom line's all that matters for him, maybe a bit dodgy. That's not really what shrewd means, certainly not in this context. It means wise enough to spot what's really going on, to be aware, not to be gullible and just receive the first piece of information, shrewd in that sense. You see, we do live in a world media-dominated, social media-dominated, in which we're led to believe that all these experts know exactly what's going to happen, and so we should just trust them. The election in the United States for the next president is, as I speak, voting is being counted, and Joe Biden looks like he's on course for being the next president of the United States, but there are questions. And President Trump is certainly going to throw the legal book at these results. And so please don't expect a definitive result from America for a number of weeks yet. But what's interesting is the pollsters were wrong in America. They had Joe Biden ahead, sometimes by quite large amounts, 17% in one case. And yet more people voted for Donald Trump in 2020 than voted for him in 2016. He may still lose, perhaps he will. But the pollsters were wrong, completely wrong, catastrophically wrong, untrustworthy, completely. And so there's no defending them, really. They were just the experts who weren't very helpful. They were wrong. And the challenge is when people look ahead to the future, either in the polls, which are hopelessly misleading in the American election, or in graphs or statistics or modelling and tell us what actually is going to happen in the future, we need a measure not so much of cynicism, but of wise and shrewd assessment. How do we know it's right? What information led to those graphs? What facts were given the modellers to come up with the models they came up with? This might just be a scenario and not a prediction. What's the difference? How should we weigh it? When we're threatened by these fear mongering statistics, which clearly are, they were horrible. They thought there might be 4,000 deaths a day. I mean, that's frightening. How are we to weigh it? What does it mean? What are actually COVID deaths? What do we mean by that? Do we mean deaths in which COVID is on the death certificate because it happens to be in a positive test, or actually COVID caused it? I mean, there are so many things here we just need to be wise about when we analyse the so-called experts. And the so-called experts need to be humble enough to say that there are equally qualified experts saying very, very different things. A, about the facts and figures and stats. B, about hospital admissions and the level of hospitalisation in our countries. Many are saying it's really not much different from the average November, December time in the UK, when hospitals are always close to their peak because of lots of winter respiratory diseases. How can we find the truth of what's going on? So we want to be shrewd in that sense. And Jesus, sending his disciples out to cope with villages which have got rivalry between Jews and Samaritans, have got an overlay of Roman oppression. In some towns, that presence would have been really strong, and in others, hardly at all. How are these people to navigate tribal politics? How are they to navigate religious passion, some of which is positive, some of which is negative? And we are in a world of tribal distinctions. The rich and the poor, those for whom lockdowns have relatively modest effect, those for whom lockdowns are devastating to their emotional well-being, and in this second lockdown, more and more livelihoods going to the wall. So how are we to weigh that? Not just listening to the stuff that's churned out by the mainstream media, which is breathtakingly biased and sadly inadequate. Because perfectly appropriate to have a graph telling you that this really horrible disease, and it is, with death resulting conditions, as it is in people who are elderly and already ill, how do we weigh that, this truly horrible condition, COVID-19, against another set of graphs that you never see, which are what about the effects of lockdown? So if you're shrewd, you'll say, yeah, fine, maybe we need to do something about that, but whatever it is we do, surely we ought to have some information about what the costs of doing it are, so that we can, in a mature way, weigh up what we're deciding here between these two costs. As Chris Whitty, in charge of Public Health England, has said quite transparently, there are no good choices. We know that. There are no easy decisions. We know that. Very few of us want to be Prime Minister at this precise point. We know that. But we ought to be faced with this balance of information. That means we need to be shrewd when we're presented with the information. We are thoughtful, aware, viewing the wider horizon, not just what's in front of us, the pumped out propaganda of death and disease, but the wider picture. That's what shrewdness is. We're not going to be taken for a ride by this. We're not just some sap watching TV that the government can push us around, tell us anything, and we'll just go, oh yes, okay, we better do that then. No. Jesus calls on us to be wise, to be shrewd. And yet, here's the dilemma and the balancing metaphor that Jesus brings. Yes, wise as a serpent, shrewd as a snake, but also innocent as a dove. Or as the older translations, harmless. So this means that though we shouldn't be gullible, we shouldn't be those who act with malice, with a bad agenda. We shouldn't be those who are manipulative and lacking in transparency. Our role should be completely different from that. Dove-like, representing peace and harmony, and a non-aggressive, non-pushy spirit. And so even those of us like me who feel deeply passionately about this are enjoined by God to speak with innocence, with harmlessness, not to attack, not to wound, not to criticise personally. I think that lockdown is immoral. For reasons we've said, it harms the poor, harms more people than it helps, etc., etc. But I'm not for 1 minute accusing the motivation of government scientists and other politicians of being immoral in their behaviour. They're not actively seeking to destroy human flourishing. I'm not saying that for a minute. I don't want to do that. Some people are saying that, and it makes me sad, because some very good people in government are being vilified. They might be wrong, but they are genuinely doing their best to look after the country and the country's interests. So when Jesus talks about this balance of shrewdness on the one hand and innocence and harmlessness on the other, that is an important goal for us to strive to today. And I commend it to you, that as you read the news or watch it, you think about the issues, you try to be wise, to dig underneath the presenting stuff, all the time asking God to cure you of cynicism. Because it's one thing to doubt the facts and figures, quite another to let that cynicism erode your soul. To be saying things like, well, all politicians are villains. They're not. These scientists are manipulators. Well, many of them are not. So it's important to have our hearts in the right place. And we've got to deal with other people. You'll meet someone in the street tomorrow. They'll be wearing a mask outside and they'll be frightened. And they'll be lecturing you if you do anything remotely near them, or even if you entered a shop and hadn't put your mask on until you were in a few steps in the door, because they are just terrified. How can you be harmless and innocent? How can you avoid the desire to correct everybody you meet and put them in your camp, whichever way round you believe, so that our behaviour has the harmlessness and the grace of this dove, which Jesus speaks of. I'm encouraged because the dove is often a metaphor in the Bible for the Holy Spirit himself, and how we need the Holy Spirit's graciousness in our dealings with one another. I wonder if we could dare to believe that a Trump supporter and a Biden supporter in the same room could have enough grace to have a civil, thoughtful, kind conversation with one another, because in both of them the Holy Spirit reigns and rules. Surely that must be possible in America. How much we should pray for that innocence and that harmlessness as bitterness continues to erupt all the way across the United States, bringing with it the threat of civil disobedience and even of violence. So we must pray for that country over these coming days, that the harmlessness of the dove will give them rest and peace, and that the politicians will be genuinely shrewd, not bitter or manipulative or self-centred, but shrewd enough to understand what's really going on and to act in line with what's best for human beings to flourish and to grow. So on this first Sunday in lockdown in the UK, God bless you, strengthen you mentally and physically. And I pray that this passage will help you navigate some of the information that's thrown at us day by day, and so that the shrewdness of the snake and the innocence of the dove will be yours today and this week as you try to reflect biblically on all the information we have before us. God bless you richly this week.